I work for a business called Marsh. If you're not really involved in insurance, you might not know us. Probably one of the biggest unknown companies. We employ about 80,000 people globally, generate about $20 billion of revenue, which puts us, I think, Fortune 170 something, and we're the biggest insurance broker in the world. We have a big cyber practice, which myself and some of my colleagues are here today are part of, about 400 of us around the world. And we place about $2 billion US dollars of premium related to cyber insurance. And the global marketplace is worth about $9 billion. So somewhere between a third and a quarter and a third of the total amount of premium placed for cyber insurance. So hopefully that means we know a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. So here's my agenda, done the introductions. I'm going to do a little bit of level setting just to make sure we're all speaking on the same page about how the insurance sector views cyber risk. Then I'm going to try and show you some scenarios that we model against. And the aim of the session is that you can use some of what I'm going to show you to go and think about how you quantify cyber risk in your own organization. So hopefully some of the tools I'm going to give you today, albeit it's a bit of a whistle stop in 20 minutes, will be practical and you can use them yourselves. The key thing is when you've understood how to quantify cyber risk in the business, and you need to know a bit about what to do with it and how to set priorities. So I'll give you a little steer about how to do that as well. Caveated by the fact that I know probably most people in the audience are from very different businesses, and I'm going to give you a framework, but you'll have to make it bespoke to your own organization. Hopefully at the end, I'll have a minute or so for some Q&A as well. So on to the level setting. So Marsh does a survey with Microsoft every couple of years. We survey multiple stakeholders across about 1,000 of our global multinational clients, and it's always focused on cyber risk and trends involved. And a couple of interesting findings come out of that. The first one is, and this is a common theme which we see and I expect you are familiar with, is that there's a language breakdown and a translation problem when we start to talk about cyber risk. The issue is the experts, and I suspect that's most of you in the room, are technical practitioners, and sometimes we find it quite hard to translate the technical language into the business context. And that's further complicated by the fact that in our survey, when we surveyed stakeholders at different levels of the organization, they also had different views about what the priorities were going to be to address cyber risk. So we've got a language problem, and we've got a problem between stakeholders in the organization not speaking the same language. And quite a startling statistic, bearing in mind this is 1,000 multinational organizations, which you'd expect to be at the maturer end of the cyber maturity curve, only about a quarter of them use any form of financial measure to talk about cyber risk in the organization. Now, the secret to addressing those translation problems, in my mind, is to put dollar values against the risks that we're talking about in the business, because those dollar values are then understood by everybody, no matter which department they're in or which stakeholder they are. So hopefully what I'm going to do today is show you some of the tools and techniques we use to quantify cyber risk. They're not perfect, but they're better than doing nothing. So I can hopefully move you out of this 75%, 74% who don't do anything into the 20-something% who do, and hopefully we'll, over time as a cohort of people will change that statistic. So how does the insurance industry think about cyber risk? Well, I think this is quite a useful slide. So top line there, you've got cyber events. So what we mean by a cyber event is some form of problem impacting either our digital systems, our data, our technology, and the digital systems can be both IT and OT. And what we're all very good at, and the speakers this morning have also talked about it, and thank you particularly to Dan, who was talking about business impacts, we're good at getting from the problem to the impact. So that middle line, most of the practitioners that I talk to are really good at this. We're very good at talking about business interruption in terms of how many systems will fail and how long they'll be down for, how many people are needed to bring them back online. We're getting better at thinking about property damage related to cyber incidents, but to be honest, that's a relatively new phenomena. This summer we started to see I think it was an Israeli attack on an Iranian steel plant, which caused an explosion. That's indicative of a trend that we're starting to see, I think. But anyway, we're good at that middle line. What we don't do very well is go from impact to consequence. So what I'm going to show you today will help us make this leap from impact to the business to a consequence. And a consequence is easy to wrap a dollar value against. So down the bottom, we've got a couple of examples. A loss of income, so a business interruption, an impact on revenue. First-party costs, that's things where we as a business need to spend money to rectify a problem. Third-party liability, so either someone in our supply chain or a customer of ours who's impacted by our problem and we have to maybe compensate them. Fines and penalties, we've talked this morning a bit about the ICO and what might happen if we have a data breach, and extortion demands, on and on. So hopefully this slide sets the scene a little bit for us. So what about scenarios? So what I'm going to show you is what we use as a kind of baseline set of scenarios. And we'll walk through these and I'll show you how you can use them in your business. I'm a massive advocate of scenarios. Matt said in the introduction, I've got a military background, and one thing the military is really good at is using scenarios to prepare us and to walk through, rehearse how we're going to respond to different events. And there's a lot of kind of military crossover with some of what we do in the cybersecurity world, because we're talking about how, I think Dan might have mentioned, actions on earlier on. So when something happens, how are we going to respond? If the plan changes, how will we adapt to it? So there's lots of crossover, and some of these techniques are really good, and they're proven through that military model. So I'm going to show you 3 scenarios. The first one's business interruption. So what we mean here is an interruption to a revenue stream. Remember, trying to get to this point about consequence. And this doesn't need to be a malicious event. We'll come to that in a minute. It could just be an accident. In fact, one of the largest claims that our team is supporting one of our clients with is born out of an acquisition. And when the parent company tried to integrate the systems of the acquired business, they lost a very important customer application that was down for a long period of time and meant they couldn't generate any revenue of it. So there's no malicious actor, it was just a problem, but it's a cyber event, and it can have an impact on revenue. So there's 2 things we have to work out to make this practical. The first one is we need to make some assumptions about how long systems might be down for, and of course it's also useful to understand which are our key systems that are related to revenue generation. So if we can think about those, and if you're a CISO in your business, you probably know a good deal about this already, then all we need to really do is think about the revenue times the system downtime. There's one other factor that we use, though, and that is what we call network dependency. So what we want to figure out is how much of our revenue is generated by the systems, and if the systems aren't fully functioning, but they're part functioning, does that mean we can't generate any revenue, or can we generate some? So we've got some simple multiplication once we've figured these things out. And I'll give you a couple of metrics that we use as baselines. Like I said, these have to be personalized to your business, but we tend to work on a 20-day or 3-week metric for system downtime. In our models that our actuaries put together, the curve's quite complicated, and it's born out of a number of claims that we've seen over a period of time. But if you don't do anything at the moment, then something's better than nothing. Just use a 20-day metric to start. You might have some other factors in your business that mean that number doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but you can adjust. The next 2 things to think about is, if we had an interruption that impacted customers, are we likely to lose some of those customers? So would there be some reputation damage, and might they walk away? You can adjust for that. And then you can think about, are there backups or workarounds to key systems, which mean even if they're offline for a period of time, we might be able to generate some revenue anyway. Okay, so that's the BI model. And if you can flesh that out amongst a group of key stakeholders with some simple multiplication, you'll have some dollar values that you can start to work around. The next scenario is a data breach. So in this scenario, and again, doesn't have to be malicious. We'll come on to that on the 3rd column, where there's a big gap at the moment. But a data breach, my colleagues will tell you, I don't know how many times we've seen a very well-intentioned marketing person, for example, looking at a customer data list, trying to set up the next, probably the seasonal outreach to say Merry Christmas to all of our valued customers, and by accident they attach the spreadsheet to the email marketing distribution list, and boom, 100,000 records of bank data, address data, and everything else has gone, and it's too late to do anything about it. So it can be accidental, doesn't have to be malicious. What we need to think about in this scenario is how many PII data records do we hold? And this is a complicated factor sometimes for businesses to get a hold of. It doesn't need to be that complicated. By data record, we're talking about a customer entry in a customer database, or an entry for an employee on an HR database. And again, if you don't do anything at the moment, ballpark's better than nothing. So just come to some sensible assumptions and then later on go and refine the numbers. But once you figure out how many data records you hold, then you can make some estimations about what data might be impacted in a breach. And if it's personally identifiable information or healthcare-related information, then absolutely definitely you're going to have to involve the Information Commissioner's Office. And if you do that, then you're going to need a legal team and probably a consulting team helping your organization walk through and get that right. You don't want to get it wrong. So once you've figured those things out, you can make some sensible assessments and adjustments for what that might cost. And you can think about what the day rates of consultants might be, and lawyers, eye-watering. Sorry if there's any lawyers in the room, but it gets expensive quite quickly. But you need to know what these numbers are going to be, and you need to have some sensible assumptions about what a data breach is going to cost the organization. And there's loads of resource out there. If you've got, we work with some very, very credible breach counsels. All their websites are full of the stories that they've supported other clients with. They give you the timelines. They tell you how long things take, so you can make some assumptions for what it might be for your business. And the final scenario, of course, is a ransomware event. And you have to pull this out separate to the other two, because in this scenario, by definition, it is our business against an adversary, and somebody is motivated to try and cause us pain in order to extort a demand from us. Things to think about here is, again, you can make some sensible estimations for what ransom demands might be. As a business, you need to think through how that would play out in practice. Most people when we talk to clients who are thinking about this for the first time, they say things like, we wouldn't pay a ransom, but they don't really think about what the consequence would be after 20 days of not being able to access their systems. And if the senior team are trying to coordinate on WhatsApp because the email's been compromised and they're in different time zones, and these things, I can tell you from my previous career, never ever happen at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. They always happen on Christmas Eve or just after the office party when everyone's had 5 pints and is trying to wind down or is jetted off on holiday. So it's complicated. So thinking through what the level of pain might be, and then we assess about whether you'd pay to get your decryption key back is a different scenario. But again, you're going to have to involve third parties, which you're going to have to pay for. And in general, what we see and what I use in the models is the ransomware event should have a combination of the previous two. So work through them sequentially, and if you figured out what your BI losses are going to be, and you figured out what your data breach losses are going to be, then you can build them into your ransomware event. So let's do it in practice. Just walk through a scenario. This is a very unfortunate client, by the way, who's really getting squeezed. So hopefully if you ever experience an attack, it won't be quite as painful as this. But our business, let's call them Acme, has experienced a ransomware attack, and the corporate network's been compromised and encrypted. Panic stations. There's a piece of malware that's been used, and it has a detrimental impact on some critical systems, including the business email and the accounting system. So paralysis, really. The C-suite's convened, and they are building their incident response team. They've brought in legal counsel. They're a highly well-known brand business with a big customer base, so they're worried about the media reporting. They know they're not going to contain this very long, and they've got PR experts supporting them as well. And unfortunately, the digital forensics team, for whatever reason, have said that it's going to be a long period of time before the backups can be utilized, because they've got to clear up the systems first, and they're not sure even where to start at this point. So we would group this together as the breach response and incident expenses part of our assumptions that we're making about cost accruing. Next, we've got ransomware negotiators being helping the business to communicate with the threat actors. Initially, a $25 million Bitcoin ransom has been demanded. after some negotiation, the amounts come down to 6.5 million. It's taken 7 days, and the business at this point has decided to pay. So they've made the exchange, and they've received back the decryption key. This is our cyber extortion element. They've still got an inability to access the corporate network, though, and during the time that they've been down so far, they've lost some revenue from some of the systems that can't sell goods to customers, and they've got an increased cost of working because they've brought in some contractors to develop some manual workarounds. So there's two quantums there, how much of our normal baseline we've lost, and then if we expend cost on trying to make it back up, we've got an increased cost of working. That all gets lumped together as what we call business interruption losses. We've got the decryption key now, though, but the process of reinstatement takes 3 weeks. We call that data restoration. Now, unfortunately, and I think the lady who was talking from the police maybe earlier was talking about triple extortion. Well, we see that, unfortunately, quite routinely. So in this case, although we've had a negotiation with the hackers and we've paid the ransom, they've turned around and stuck 2 fingers up to us and sold the data on the dark web anyway. So they've given us the decryption key back, but we didn't realize they had 100,000 records of customer data, and that's now just been sold. We have to reach out and notify those subjects, and the ICO is all over us, so now we've got to go through this process of utilizing legal support and consultants or whatever we have to do to address the investigation. Data theft, response costs. And then now there's going to be some legal proceedings, so we're going to have some defense costs as well. I did say this was a real squeeze on this customer. Hopefully it's never going to be as bad for you guys, but work on the worst case, hope for the best, that terrible old saying, but plan for the worst. So that's how we group together what the losses might look like, and I really hope that by laying it down on a timeline like this and trying to group the costs into sensible chunks, the business can understand what this might look like and where the costs might get accrued. And if you can do that, then you get to some very valuable conversations amongst the business stakeholders about where the priorities might be to address the problems. So let's finish this off, and we'll whack some dollar values against this. So remember what I said, you've got to personalize the metrics for your own business, but sensible estimation of 500 grand for this breach response cost, that would be kind of day rates of all the support we've got and the digital forensics team. We know what the ransom demand is that we've ended up paying, 6.5 million. I've used a metric of £15 per data record breached. We do have some really good data around that, but mainly the data comes out of the US where you've got a very litigious environment, and it's expected that you're going to run things like credit monitoring on behalf of impacted customers. It's not the same here, but I think we're going in that direction. But again, data records times a cost of rectification. Again, third-party costs really, or costs of consultants, 350K on our data restoration. Sorry, I used those the wrong way around. 1.5 million in addressing our victims, our customers, and 1.5 million in accrued costs where we are managing our lost revenue and increased cost of working. And then 650K in addressing the ICO investigation and defense costs. Anyone want to do super quick maths? So I did it for you. 11 million quid for this example. So like I said, this is a bit of a squeeze on this business, and you need to make this personal for your own business. But that is a mechanism, relatively simple one, and I hope that people in their own teams are using scenarios. If you're doing things like tabletop exercises to figure out who does what when a problem occurs, just push it another level and put some dollar values next to it. And that's a really helpful tool in starting to get some quantification. So when you know what the costs of those problems might be, then you're in a really good informed position to start thinking about how you address them. And one of the challenges we often see from clients is, well, where do I start, and what is the priority? Do I buy insurance? Do I spend on technical controls? Do I hire more people? Do I do training for my staff? Well, I'm going to show you a couple of frameworks you can use to start to think about how you make those decisions now. So this is what we call the top 12 controls, or the top cybersecurity controls from an insurer lens. So these are 12 things that the insurance business is saying, when clients don't do these things, we pay claims. So these are directly correlated to losses that insurers pay. So it's quite a nice way of thinking about, well, if this is the 12 things that insurers say lead to claims, if I address these 12 things as a priority, then I'm going to be in a better position to avoid those consequences that I just showed you. When I speak to clients, most of the time we're obsessed by this bit, by technical controls and buying in technology. Obviously that has its place, but it's important to realize that other stakeholders in the business and the board might not just be thinking about the acquisition of technology. They're probably thinking about some of the cultural things we might do in the organization, like training people, phishing awareness, incident planning, and utilizing those scenarios is a really good way of getting to that bottom left-hand corner. And then we've got some governance and procedural stuff that the business can do as well. And some of this has a crossover with technology, of course, when we're looking at login and monitoring and vulnerability management. But equally, some of this stuff is just about setting good processes in the business, having a cadence, having a mechanism for addressing CVEs when they're published, etc. And it's amazing how many of the clients that we work with who are mature organizations lack some of these cyber hygiene factors, or they don't do it very well, or they don't implement it across the whole business. And the bottom right-hand corner, if you're not doing this already, is the direction of travel, because we've seen so many examples of supply chain related losses where vendors and dependency on vendors means that the business is vulnerable to somebody else, not just our own network. Okay, so that's the insurer lens. That's if you want to think about how priorities around what insurers would look at. There's 12 things. And of course, the next thing is people often say, well, should we think about insurance? Do we buy the right amount of insurance if we already buy it? Well, one of the things is most people don't really understand what the coverages are. So this is generally what cyber insurance policies cover. And you can see here that these generally align to those losses that I showed you on the timeline. So if you start to think about how much loss you might accrue in any of those parts of the timeline, then you can start to think about whether the business has appetite to swallow that in the event of a loss, event of a claim. You don't need insurance if you're going to run the risk on your own balance sheet. And the second thing you can figure out is, are we buying enough insurance? So if the $11 million big red line that I showed you on that timeline is what you're worried about, then you need to be buying at least 10 million of insurance, probably 15, or you need to have a very good conversation with the board to say, that's the likely scenario that we might face. Are we comfortable we can manage that on the balance sheet? I'm not trying to sell insurance here. Obviously, I'm a broker, so that's part of what I do. But and a good outcome for me is that a client makes an informed decision. I don't want clients to spend money on things that they don't need, but you need to have some quantification to understand if you need it in the first place. So that's a whistle-stop tour of a couple of models that we use to think about scenarios and how they lead to consequences, financial consequences, and then a couple of ways you can think about how you set priorities in the business. Bearing in mind, I said stakeholders often aren't aligned around the challenge. Use the dollar numbers, pound numbers in our case, same thing at the moment, I think, unfortunately, but use those dollar values to try and get some collaboration and agreed priorities in the business, and you'll be in a really good place to set priorities and to set strategies around how you address cyber risk. Hope that's been useful. That's the kind of Marsh pitch. Happy to take any questions if I've got time.
Yeah, brilliant. No, thanks so much for that, Gareth. Really, really interesting. Just, I'll open it up to the floor in just a moment. Just a really quick one for me, almost a cheeky one, but investments going up in the area of protection and defence. We're seeing threats going up. Are claims going up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think cyber insurance, we talk about this quite a lot, it gets a bad press. There's been a lot of very public, newsworthy discussions about insurers not paying cyber problems. Mondelez is probably the most headline example. The issue there is, though, that there are customers making claims against the insurance market when they didn't have the right coverage, or at least the insurance industry is saying you didn't buy the right policy. And unfortunately, it's the exceptions that get reported, not the norm. So in our data, we think about 95% of the notifications that get made to the insurance industry for cyber problems get paid. So insurance pays. And the size of those claims has rocketed over the last few years, mainly due to ransomware. But the other theme, of course, has been that we've been through a pandemic and everybody's rushed to adopt technology, so the attack surface has increased. And I think the speakers earlier were saying the same thing. So you've got multiple phenomenons, you've got a big increase in the vulnerability of businesses, and you've got a professionalized threat actor taking advantage of that to try and extort money or cause pain to those businesses. And that has led to a lot of losses. And when insurance pays losses, unfortunately, as an insurance buyer, that means that premiums go up. Most in the industry would argue that cyber insurance has been underpriced because people didn't really get it, and it's a discretionary purchase. So it was priced cheap to try and sell it. We've seen a correction in that pricing now. I hope, for the sake of the industry and for the sake of buyers, that we see a real leveling now so that people understand and can budget properly, because it's very hard to do that if pricing's all over the place. But we will see, I think, a period of stability now, albeit versus a few years ago, pricing is significantly increased.
Okay.
But it's probably in the right place.
Biggest loss?
Well, that's a complicated question. And clearly, we don't have a view of everything across the industry, only our own clients and what our insurance partners tell us. But earlier this year or last year and into this year, one of the biggest losses we've seen has been about $400 million.
Wow.
The cost of the business will be much more than that, but they bought a $400 million tower of insurance and it's exhausted. So when that's blown, then it's down to them. So
that's huge, isn't it?
Big. But that's a big global multinational. And
no, fair comment. Anyone got a quick question from the audience? I can probably run one. Gentleman up here, if we could get a mic through.
Cheers.
Thank you.
As an insurance company, do you actually pay ransoms?
It's a really good question. So a couple of things to appreciate here. And if you don't do insurance, there's no way you'd know this. But if there's three parties in insurance: customer buying insurance, broker, that's us, and then a market that writes the insurance. So we're a middleman, right? We go between customer who says, I've got a problem, help me address it, and a market that's willing to sell products to fit that problem. So we don't pay anything. We help clients navigate a market and get the right solutions. But if you are an insurance company like AIG or Chubb or some of the other big household names that you might know, there is a distinction made in the policy about reimbursing costs that the client incurs. So the insurance company is paying back the ransom amount to the customer who's paid the ransom themselves. At the moment, there are some complexities around sanctions issues, and it's really important if you're a business about to pay a ransom or considering it, that you've done some sanctions checks on who the criminal entity is and whether you can move the money. But if you've got the right support from lawyers and extortion experts, they'll guide you through that anyway. So you wouldn't fall foul of that if you've got the right support. But yes, the payment of a ransom is a legitimate claim as far as the insurance industry is concerned. And if you paid it, you would be reimbursed.